Welcome to our presentation this afternoon. It's fake news, or is it? Disrupting disinformation. My name is Jim Britton, and I'm the president of the City Club Board. The mission of the City Club is to inform, connect, and engage our community to strengthen civil health in our region. We emphasize civil conversations and listening to others. We begin by acknowledging with humility that the land where we are today is the territory of the people of the Salish Sea. Their presence is imbued in the waterways, shorelines, valleys, and mountains of the traditional homelands of the coastal Salish people, and it has been that way since time immemorial. As always, I'd like to thank our volunteers, and I'd also like to thank those of you in the community who are our sponsors, and they are Peace Health, St. Joseph's Medical Center, Bruce and Claudia Descend, Danny Neal, real estate broker of the Molyacht Group, Firehouse Artworks Event Center, Colshan CPAs, the Opportunity Council, Salish Current, Village Books, Western Washington University, and the Whatcom Community Foundation, and also a big thanks to our caterer today, Good Bowls. Let's acknowledge all of those people. For those of you who are not members, I'd like to encourage you to become a member. So, and that's one way. Jill has one of those. I'm going to give you 3 ways to do it. So, being a member really does support the important work that we do. You become a financial and sustaining support for all of the great speakers we bring in. And as an additional small benefit, you do get a slight $5 discount on the meal for each of our programs. The dues are $40 per person, $70 for a household of 2, and $10 for those who are under 25. You can become a member by filling out one of those forms that Jill had that's on the table, the yellow one. And you can just leave it there, and then we will take that and we will invoice you. Or you can go to the website and become a member through the prompts. Or you could take care of it today by seeing our treasurer, who is right there walking. And he's at the table right around the corner, and he'd take care of that for you. Another thing I'd like to bring to your attention, especially for those of you who are members, is it's really important to make your reservations in a timely manner. So we base our meal order on ticket sales plus a little bit of a cushion. So to facilitate the process, we really do encourage you to take care of that in a timely manner if you could. So we're coming up on election season, so our next 3 programs are going to be directed to candidate and issue forums. And in October, our meeting would normally be our meetings are on the 4th Wednesday of the month, but in October, because of the ballot drop on the 3rd week of October, we're going to move the meeting up to the 16th. So I'm giving you a heads up now that we're going to have it then. It's going to be more useful to everybody to be right about the time of the ballot drop instead of maybe after the time some of you have voted. So that's what we're going to do. And we will give you more information. Well, we do know that the forum for October will be the state initiatives and the Washington Supreme Court justices, if that is a contested race after the primary. So I'd like to also remind you, if you have not already done so, please silence your cell phones. With that, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Amy Nelson. In addition to serving on our programs committee, Amy is the editor of the Salish Current, one of our sponsors.
Thank you, Jim. This is going to be a fascinating hour and a half, I'm sure. We swim in a sea of information in newspapers and online newsrooms, television, radio, and podcasts, social media, emails from friends, family, strangers. Not all of this information is helpful, useful, or even true. The misinformation shared without intent, disinformation purposeful and intended to deceive or mislead. So in either case, people become convinced of false information and act on it. So as we jump into this political season fully on, Western Washington University professor of psychology, Dr. Ira Hyman, will share with us what he knows about the misinformation and disinformation we hear, its prevalence, how to identify it, and what we can do, what others can do to staunch the flow, to steer into the truth. Dr. Hyman is a professor of psychology at Western. He's published research on how false ideas stick with us, how conspiracy theories take shape, how song lyrics are remembered, creation of false childhood memories. And he even has evidence to support the intrusive so-called earworm, that song that you just can't get out of your head. So I'm delighted to welcome you, Ira. Turn it over to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you all. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I enjoy talking about misinformation and disinformation. I will note that it is depressing sometimes. So I'm going to try and both do the depressing part, but give you some reasons to be hopeful and optimistic by the time we end today. That's always part of my goal as we're going through these sorts of things. I want to give you my basic outline for what I want to talk about today. I'm going to start with just defining things, how we as a field define misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. And we're going to talk about some of the recent disinformation campaigns that are showing up now as part of the election season that we're going into. It's been a lot of work in the last 24 hours keeping up to date with that, but we're going to do our best with it. And then I want to talk about why we are all so susceptible. Note that I'm going to use the term we here. I'm going to talk about people in general, but this applies to you and it applies to me. There's nothing that makes me particularly good at being any better at protecting myself from disinformation. And then finally, I want to turn to some discussion of possible solutions. Some of those solutions are things that we as individuals can do better. But I want to be really clear that critical thinking, our own work by us as individuals, is not going to be enough to save us from the flood of disinformation. That we also desperately need reform in how news media work and how social media platforms work. So I'll mention some of that stuff as well. We got to be focused on both parts of this as we're looking at these sorts of things. So let's start with our definitions and some examples of these things as we go along. When we're defining misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories, I want to start with what we mean when we say misinformation. As a field, as a psychologist, usually when I say misinformation, I mean misleading information or a lie or an error. Usually when we're looking at these sorts of things, it's one or two, just a few pieces of information at a time. It's not some overarching campaign with a goal in some fashion. In that sense, it's typically inadvertent, meaning that it's not intentional that people are trying to mislead you, except in psychology experiments. And so, you know, our goal is not necessarily to lead people to lies in that situation. And we can encounter this in a lot of different ways. So with knowledge information, we might encounter incorrect information in a textbook even, or outdated information, or just false information, or somebody might think they know something and it's not actually true. And so there's sometimes it's just knowledge that's incorrect. I come from a background where we study eyewitness memory. Some of my research has to do with that. And for eyewitnesses, they may pick up incorrect information from questions that police officers ask with good intentions. They may pick up false information from other witnesses who have heard or seen things. They might watch the news and get some false information from that way. So there's a lot of different ways in which we can pick up false, misleading information as eyewitnesses. And when we look at our own personal experiences, the things that we remember from our lives, not every one of our memories is completely accurate. We change those stories over time. We modify them in response to suggestions from other people, from our friends, from our families. We oftentimes come to an agreed-upon version of the past. And that's really important for social groups to have an agreed-upon version of the past. It's not that damaging sometimes, but sometimes false memories can be quite damaging when we look at this. With misinformation, sort of the classic studies in psychology have to do with things like having somebody watch a slideshow or a video and having them originally see a stop sign and then misleading them with a question that suggests to them it was a yield sign. We find that people can make those sort of changes. We can also lead people to watch a video where somebody steals something. This is actually from research with my own students. And if there's an innocent bystander nearby and that innocent bystander shows up in a lineup, people are very likely to incorrectly identify him as the perpetrator because he's really familiar. And in some of our other work, we get people to create false childhood memories. I tell you about things that actually happened to you based on talking to your parents or sibling for some of you, I suspect. I might not be able to reach your parents at this point. Mean, harsh. And then we suggest you remember the time that you were attending the wedding of a friend of the family, and while you were at the wedding, you happened to bump into the table that the punch bowl was sitting on, and you spilled punch on the parents of the bride. We find that a fair proportion of people will come to not only agree that this might have happened, but actually tell the story and accept it as a story. So that we know that people can adopt bits of false information and add it to a story and add it to their knowledge set. When we look at disinformation, when we start talking about disinformation, sometimes people will consider it a subset of misinformation, but it's really quite different in many respects because it's a mix of true and false information. So it includes some misleading information, but it also has true information in it, and usually there's an overarching frame, a narrative, a story that is used to hold everything together so that it makes a coherent narrative for you as we're looking at it. These are always, when we're talking about disinformation campaigns, there's always an intentionality to it. These are intentional campaigns. There's some political, there's some economic goal that's attached to most disinformation campaigns. And for this reason, I actually include fraud here when I'm thinking about disinformation. Many of you are, actually all of us are targets of fraud campaigns. And those invariably have some true stuff, some false stuff, and they have an economic goal. Somebody's trying to steal your money. And so when we're looking at disinformation, there's always some political or economic goal. Sometimes that goal is to bias people or steal their money, but sometimes it's to get them to adopt a false idea. But with a lot of disinformation campaigns, the goal is not necessarily to get you to believe the false stuff, but to doubt the true stuff. To muddy the waters is the phrase that's used when we talk about disinformation campaigns. And you can think of this as throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. This is a metaphor that a lot of people use. And even if not everything sticks, something sticks. And even if none of the spaghetti sticks, if it had sauce on it, there's still going to be a stain on the wall. That something remains when we're looking at this sort of stuff. So that there's something that sticks around. But a lot of disinformation campaigns, while it has an intentional campaign, there are also a lot of what we refer to as unwitting agents. People who spread the false information believing it themselves. And they're not actually necessarily gaining directly in that political or that it's not intentional on their part. They think they're sharing something that's true. And so there are a lot of unwitting agents when we look at this. And there's some classic disinformation campaigns. So, I mean, the stuff about disinformation campaigns goes back to propaganda. It goes back to Russian disinformation campaigns. So even in the 1980s, the KGB was spreading false information about the origin of the AIDS virus and calling it a CIA-created virus and spreading a lot of false information. But this is not just sort of political stuff. There's economic stuff. So that the smoking companies spread a lot of disinformation campaigns about whether or not tobacco causes cancer. And for a long period of time, they argued vehemently that it did not. And you see other sort of climate change denial campaigns that are disinformation campaigns funded by primarily oil companies. So that there is a lot of disinformation campaigns. And some of these disinformation campaigns, they donate money to groups like the Heartland Institute, which has both information about climate change denial and a smoking group, so that there's a motivation here. There's a political motivation. There's an economic motivation behind almost all of these disinformation campaigns when we start talking about them. We'll turn to election disinformation in a few minutes here. When we're looking at conspiracy theories, I see a lot of similarities to disinformation campaigns. And the reason I see that is because there's usually a mix of true and false information, so that there's some true stuff, there's some false stuff, and it's all combined together to make a coherent or a nice narrative, wrap it up. But the difference here is that it's rarely as much of an intentional campaign. It's not really clear what somebody's political or economic goals are when they're spreading a conspiracy theory. And so in that sense, it's spread by people who actually believe these things, believe the conspiracy theories. They become their own unwitting agents, that they adopt this sort of stuff. And for many of them, I'm not sure why they spread it. I think some people spread conspiracy theories because they're kind of fun. I have a T-shirt that says birds aren't real, which is a fake conspiracy theory that somebody just started as a lark, so to speak. You're welcome. You're welcome. I'll be here all week, every day. And with conspiracy theories, there are a lot of oldies but goodies, right? I mean, the idea that there was more than one shooter at the Kennedy assassination, or it was an inside job in some fashion, that the moon landing was a hoax. That one still floats around out there as well, that 9/11 was an inside job in some fashion. So these are classic conspiracy theories. There are more current ones as well that you should be aware of. So there are a lot of conspiracy theories surrounding the child trafficking of children, for sexual purposes, and this happens. But there are a lot of conspiracy theories around it that tag it to other people and suggest other locations. So I'm showing you a place called Comet Pizza in Washington, D.C., which was part of a rumor mill that they were trafficking children through the basement. The building actually doesn't have a basement. But this gentleman here was arrested because he went in to rescue the children with an AR and started shooting in the location. One of my other favorite conspiracy theories these days is the idea of lizard people. At one time, when I first encountered this one, I was like, nobody believes this. But there's this idea, a lot of people actually believe this, that many of our elites and leaders are actually space alien lizards wearing human disguises. Yes, seriously. And it's so serious that this guy is the Nashville bomber who took a large van full of explosives into downtown Nashville and blew up a city block in Nashville, luckily in the evening when there weren't people there. But there are other current conspiracy theories that those jet trails are actually chemtrails causing you harm, that 5G may cause cancer and infertility. These things are not true. I want to just be really clear about that. And there's this whole idea that the Earth is flat in some fashion. You know, the flat Earth conspiracies that are out there, which we know is not true because cats would have pushed everything off by now. So we know that this one's not true at all when we're looking at it.
I need to drop the mic. We're getting static on the recording. I do apologize.
Oh, we're going to switch out.
We're going to switch out.
I don't know. How are we doing? Okay. I want to talk about, the consequences of disinformation campaigns, because there have been a lot of disinformation campaigns in the last few years. The idea that COVID is a hoax, or it's not really dangerous, or that masks are ineffective. Disinformation surrounding the election in 2020, that it was stolen, that the ballots were rigged, and that the media was lying to you about these things. Disinformation around vaccines, that they are risky, that they're not needed, that they're ineffective, or that they contain microchips. Bill Gates promotes vaccines, so that's where that one comes in. But these things have meaningful consequences because people adopted some of these disinformation campaigns around how not problematic COVID was. We had more than 1 million people die in the United States and millions around the world that need not have died if it had been addressed more effectively. Because of the disinformation campaigns around the 2020 election, we had a refusal to acknowledge the election results. That led to the January 6th insurrection, and now tons of measures in various states trying to make it harder to vote. And so there are consequences to these disinformation campaigns. Because of the disinformation around vaccines, you have people not wanting to vaccinate their kids, but also refusing themselves to get vaccinated against COVID, which now actually shows at first COVID infections were more prevalent in more democratic areas because that was large cities where it was spreading first. But now because of differential uptake of the vaccines, COVID rates and deaths are more prevalent in more rural areas and in more Republican areas. So that these beliefs, adopting these things, really has serious consequences. And the other consequence I always like to talk about is that this has probably undoubtedly disrupted some of your friend and family social networks. That for most of you, you find that there are certain people that you no longer talk to, that you've dropped friends with, or at least that there are certain conversations you're not having with friends and family. Almost every person I know who does research on disinformation has at least one family member who refused to get the COVID vaccine. I'm in that group. That I actually don't know whether or not that person has eventually been vaccinated. We've had multiple conversations, but they adopted a lot of the disinformation around the COVID vaccine, and it's hard to get through that. Let's talk about some of the current ones that are out there for this election season that you should be aware of. The big one of the big ones that's been around for a while is the idea that part of the election fraud is voting by non-citizens. And this is tied to the great white replacement conspiracy theory or disinformation campaign, the idea that there's a conspiracy to bring in immigrants to quickly make them citizens and to have them vote even if they're not citizens, and to replace all of the white people in the country with brown people. So this is lovely because it's anti-immigrant and it's election fraud. It's primarily adopted by Republican voters. But the AP in 2022 in a survey asked this statement and asked people whether or not they agree with it, the idea that there is a group of people in this country who are trying to replace native-born Americans with immigrants who agree with their political views. 32% of all Americans said they agreed with that, and a majority of Republicans agreed with that in 2020. Now, this idea of voter fraud is showing up this year again. And it's very prevalent, so that it has been linked to what's happening with the possible votes this fall by the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. It was showing up frequently. I lost track of the number of different speakers who mentioned this at the Republican National Convention last week. Was that just last week? Oh my gosh. It's been a constant on Fox News. And I'll just read you from May of this year, the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, his statement was, the answer is that it's unanswerable. That is the problem. We all know intuitively that a lot of illegals are voting in federal elections, but it's not something that is easily provable. We don't have the number. That's because the number is really close to zero. But nonetheless, you have a lot of people spreading this. Now, I'm going to try and every now and then use a Democratic or liberal bit of disinformation, but I'm going to note for you right now that I am not going to do false balance. The majority of disinformation is being spread by conservatives at this point, and most of it is targeted toward conservatives. And to try and present things as though they're balanced is a form of disinformation. False balance is a form of disinformation. So we have to be really careful with these sorts of things. But here's one where I can do a little bit of that. I was really busy last week collecting disinformation around the Trump assassination attempt. And so there was a lot of conservative disinformation and frames, sort of narratives about how things stick together for this, and it was a hit ordered by Biden or by global elites, which would be legal according to the Supreme Court. Never mind. That it was caused by violent rhetoric on the left. That it was an Antifa assassin. That's anti-fascist. Assassin was involved in it. Or, I like this one a lot, that God protected Trump. And that fits really well with the narrative that they see Trump as being God's messenger for some people. And this is another common narrative, concerns about DEI, and so there's a nice framing out there that a DEI head of the Secret Service is the reason why this happened, because she was only appointed because she was a woman. She has since resigned. I believe it was yesterday. And although I have not seen this yet, I'm willing to place money, my usual bet of 1/4, that within the week we will see that it's all part of a cover-up because they fired her. So I haven't seen it yet. I don't know. Michael, have you seen it yet? Not yet, but I'm putting money on this one, that it'll be out there by the end of the week. Michael, I know from the University of Washington. Some liberal disinformation around this as well, though, is that this was actually staged by Trump. And some of you probably encountered this idea that it was staged and that it was fake blood, or they come up with wrestling examples. He had a blade in his fingers and he cut himself. There's no, okay, yeah, all right. That it wasn't a gun, it was a BB gun. Or it was an inside job. The shooter was actually Republican, you know. He wasn't Antifa. Look, here's the thing, and this highlights this. Immediately after some of these events, and you can count on this for almost every event, we're going to look at another one in just a moment, rumors circulate. A lot of rumors circulate. Some of those rumors get picked up by the news media and spread widely by some news media personalities and spread widely on social media. The ones that work are going to be the ones that stick, meaning that they fit within your cognitive system, that they fit within a narrative, they fit within a good story. And so there'll be a lot of stuff that's out there immediately, and they'll settle in on things. And I don't know that we've settled completely from the assassination attempt, but the God is protecting Trump seems to be a hallmark of what's being spread out there these days. And, you know, I went to bed last Friday having updated my talk with this, assuming I was good. And then on Sunday, the news changed. So I was a little busy on Sunday and Monday tracking disinformation out there on the internet. This one I can't easily group, Republican, Democrat. But the disinformation that I've seen coming primarily from the conservatives on this one is that it's illegal for Democrats to change candidates at this point. No. Or that it's illegal to transfer campaign funds to Harris. Most of you have seen these, I'm assuming, right? Yeah, they've been talked about a lot. There are already further claims on whether or not Kamala Harris is actually legal to run for president, or claims that Kamala is a DEI candidate. That's going to be one that sticks. It's already being spread a lot. The idea that she's a DE candidate, or this one I love a lot, it's showing up a lot, is that Kamala Harris is actually not black. You know, that she is the child of Jamaican and East Indian immigrants, and so Republicans are like, yeah, she's not really black. So there's that part of it as well that's being spread. And that's something that's both true and being used to frame a narrative about how she's not legitimate. And so you're using the true information, but putting it within a context to sort of twist it into a bit of false information when we're looking at this. Oh, by the way, Joe Biden didn't actually have COVID. There's a distinct possibility that he's dead. This has been spread. He's actually unaware that he's withdrawn. That's how bad his cognitive decline has been. Or he was actually infected with COVID on purpose. I've seen all of these on the internet within the last 48 hours. And there is obviously a conspiracy to replace Joe Biden. He is being pushed out by global elites. He didn't actually write the letter of resignation. He didn't write his endorsement of Kamala Harris. Someone else did all these sorts of stuff. And the staffers actually scheduled the debate early so it would be really clear that he was having cognitive declines so they could replace him. See? That's why it all worked out this way. And yeah, Hillary is planning to become the candidate. Don't forget that part. You think I'm serious. Michael Flynn, who was, you know, a former head of intelligence and an Army general, has actually circulated that one. And then Kamala Harris was obviously involved in covering up Biden's decline. And this one shows up all over the place. So this was posted Monday by the Republican National Committee, and I'll just read you the very bottom part there. What did Kamala know about Biden's decline, and when did she know it? It's the cover-up of the century. You see, you know, other things. So Trump yesterday, no, I guess Monday, tried a new tactic, you know, where he was saying that the nomination is being stolen from Biden. They stole the race from Biden after he won the primaries. First, these people are the real threat to democracy. And other Republicans have been spreading this one as well. And J.D. Vance, who is the Republican vice presidential nominee, has also been saying similar sorts of things, that the Democratic Party is claiming that without evidence that Biden was pushed out by a bunch of billionaires and Barack Obama and Nancy Pelosi. All your basic, you know, people you want to go with. So that's all part of a story that's consistent. And so it's really easy to spread these sorts of things. When I think about disinformation, I really love this graphic. It comes from my good friend, Professor Kate Starbird, down at the University of Washington, who's associated with one of the directors of the Center for an Informed Public down there. And her argument is that we need to think of disinformation, the spread of disinformation, as being something of a circular process. That at the bottom you have the audiences, but the audiences don't just receive information, they post things on social media. They make suggestions. And so a lot of the original stuff comes from the audience percolating things up. Some of that gets adopted by news media or by people with larger audiences on social media. Those are the people we think of as the political elites. And then they spread that stuff back around. And sometimes they start it themselves. And so we think of this as sort of a top-down and a bottom-up spread of information. From the top, you've got the media, political elites. They set a frame overall. And so this frame about fraud in the election and illegals voting is a big frame for the conservative media and has been for a long time. And it fits both with sort of fraud in the election and it fits with some racist versions. And we really need to note that many of the disinformation campaigns have an underpinning of racism. Sometimes it's, sort of a little subtle, and sometimes it's just blatant when we're looking at these sorts of things. But it also comes from the bottom up. Lots of rumors start after any event. Then there's a lot of social media posts. And some of those things are true things, but they can be twisted to be seen in a different way, so that there was ink blurring from Sharpie pens in the Arizona ballots. But it was expected. And it did not destroy the ballots. But once you see that, people are like, oh, this is how they're trying to cheat us. And so it spreads really quickly when you look at these sorts of things. And it really is, in this sense, the throwing of the spaghetti here. All these different sorts of things that can be picked up and used by people when we're looking at this. All right, so there's your disinformation definition. I want to talk quickly about why we're all so susceptible. And this is me as a cognitive psychologist talking about all this sort of stuff. This is the stuff that I study a lot. One part of this is something called the illusory truth effect. And the illusory truth effect is if I repeat something, you're more likely to believe that it's true. Let me just say that again. If I repeat something, you're more likely to believe that it's true. And this works for both true information and for false information. And sometimes with disinformation campaigns, repeating doesn't just make you believe the false stuff, but it can muddy the waters, make you doubt the true stuff. It also has other effects that we're looking at. I want to actually, a little audience participation here. I want you to think about your answer to this question. What percentage of people in the U.S. believe that the government should do more to fight climate change? Think about what percentage you think it is. We're going to do a show of hands here in just a moment. How many of you think that the percentage of Americans who think the government should do something more to fight climate change is less than 20%? How many of you think it's between 20 and 30%? How about 30 to 40%? 40 to 50%? Okay, 50 to 60. 60 to 70%. Anybody over 80%? Okay, the actual number from a survey this year is 76%. And this is what we refer to as a false consensus effect. One of the things that happens when you're repeatedly exposed to false information is not just you adopt it, but you think that a lot of people believe it. And since you've seen so much stuff and there's been so much false equivalence in the news media about climate change, you're likely to think, well, must be a lot of people believe it, that it's not true. Actually, most people have accepted it's true. They're seeing the effects every day. And most people want something to be done about it. Individual things vary, but it's pretty clear that this is happening. There are a lot of ways in which I can make something just feel true by the way in which I present it. One of them is just putting a picture with it. I'm not going to put a picture with it. I'm not going to cheat quite so much there. But if I put a picture with it, even if it's not an illustrative picture, it makes it feel more true. And the other things that can make something feel more true is if I make it easier to read or comprehend. So if I use a better font, if I have clearer text, if I speak more clearly, if I'm not getting static on my microphone. If I get, and you think there's research on that. Static on the microphone makes people less trusting of the person than what they're saying. Speaking with a clear accent is better than having a bad accent that people have a hard time understanding. So there are a lot of things that I can make it easier for you to comprehend when I'm saying it. It makes it feel more true when we look at it. If I place my false information with true information, if I give it a reliable source, it makes it feel more true as well. And the question is, what's a reliable source for different people? We may not agree on that. And some sources, even if they're not reliable, some people think that it is reliable. If I make a connection to your existing knowledge base. So if I present this information and it fits with things that you already believe, it makes you more likely to adopt that false information. If I connect it to your view of yourself, or if I connect it to your view of the group that you're a member of, it makes you more likely to adopt that information. In this sense, it's got to fit with those frames, with those narratives, with those stories that people are telling, and people are more likely to believe that. And what's really kind of disturbing, fun, as a cognitive psychologist, it's fun. As a member of society, it's disturbing. You actually don't have to say the false information. You can just imply it. You don't have to come directly out and say it. And people remember the implication if you didn't. So you know that Joe Biden is getting older, right? Did you know that there was a expert, Parkinson's expert, who frequently went to the White House in the spring of this year? Was showing up there frequently. What do you think? Is it possible that Joe Biden has Parkinson's disease? He doesn't. But this version of noting that he's old and the Parkinson's specialist went there, that part's true, and he is old. And you can find that information by looking at who shows up at the White House. It was spread originally by a conservative blogger. It was picked up in part of a story in the New York Times about a month ago, making the implication that, without saying it directly, but making the implication that Biden has Parkinson's disease. He doesn't. He has to stutter. It's fine. And he's getting older. Yeah. But this is the power of asking questions. You don't actually have to say the thing. You can get the audience to complete it for you. It's essentially that you can lead a horse to water, and you can actually make him. Thank you. By doing this sort of stuff, I can make you adopt false information. This is something that we're studying with my students at Western these days, is how people create it themselves are more likely to believe in that situation. I also like to note that there are various thinking styles that people take when they go through social media. We're not critical thinking when we're going through social media. We're doing this stuff called heuristic thinking, which really means we're not thinking deeply about it. We're looking for cute cat videos or puppy videos. That's great. That's why we need social media out there. But the sort of these basic heuristics is that we have a general acceptance of most information we encounter. I'm taking advantage of that today. You're trusting me. We think that most people we interact with are good faith actors, and most people are. And because of that, when we're typically just getting around in the media and social media and news media, we just have a bias to trust people. We assume that they're honest. We assume that they're doing a good faith effort to tell us the truth. It's actually not the case, but we start with that. And so we have this as sort of a basic approach. And if we do engage in critical thinking, this is part of why critical thinking won't necessarily save us. When we get engaged in critical thinking, sometimes it's because people encourage us to. You need to think a little more critically about that climate change stuff. And here's actually a website that you can go look at. And so people are suggesting, and once you start down that path, the other suggestions will come to you. And so you can get stuck critical thinking within a set of information. And it feels like you're getting more deeply into the problem domain. And what you are doing is following your way down a rabbit hole of disinformation sometimes. And social media, Google, YouTube, all of these things make it easy once you start searching for one thing to find other things because of the nature of the algorithmic process is there. And here's the cool thing. Critical thinking is actually good for your memory. Thinking deeply about something is really good for your memory. And that's a good thing, except when what you're thinking about is false information. Then you're more likely to remember it and more likely to adopt it. Because you rehearse it, you imagine it, you compare it to other stuff, you make connections to other information. It leads to really good information for that false stuff. And so for people who actually go down disinformation rabbit holes, go down conspiracy rabbit holes, they really know the stuff they're talking about. They have really done an in-depth study of that. They've just done a depth study and not a very much breadth study. We'll talk about how to avoid this. And then here's the other part of it, is that we all share information on the Internet these days in various social media platforms, and we're encouraged to share. That's the whole point of social media platforms. It's really easy for you to share information on social media platforms, and generally our goal is not accuracy when we're sharing. It's some other sort of goal when we're looking at it. What are our goals? Our goal is entertainment, keeping other people entertained, but it's also an expression of our identity. It's our expression of our group membership. And so I'm a part of this group, and so I need to share this other stuff that I'm seeing. And I need to identify with this group. And so by doing this, you're sharing the stuff that says this is who I am. But if your group is sharing disinformation, it means you're likely to share that information as well when we're looking at this sort of stuff. And it's just so easy to share information on social media, just one click usually. It's enough to repost it yourself. Is it possible that people can reject misinformation? And again, we're talking about the cognitive processes here. Yeah, but it's hard. We can use warnings. So there's a lot of research, old research on misinformation, some new research on sort of the spread of disinformation that shows that if you warn people before you expose them to false information, they are less likely to adopt it. Warning them afterwards doesn't necessarily do as much good. But the best approach is to use what we refer to as a truth sandwich, where you say, here's the truth, and I'm going to tell you something that's false, here's the false thing, and then remind you of the truth. And so we can do a truth sandwich, and this tends to be the sort of thing that makes people less likely to adopt the false information than if they only saw the false information. But I want to give you the side note here, and this is a critical thing. You're best off if you're never exposed to the false information. And so even in these sort of things with warnings, you still sometimes adopt the false information. But it's better to have a warning than not a warning. The other thing that we can do is sort of slow down the sharing, is to make accuracy your goal when you're looking at this. And with eyewitnesses, we typically put them in situations where we ask them to only tell us the stuff that they're absolutely sure about. They still will tell us true information, but it decreases the amount of false information they give us. On social media, you can only share if you're for political. I mean, share all the cat videos you want. I'm fine with that. But with political information, only share if you're sure. If you checked. And some platforms can do some of this, and Twitter at least used to. I'm not on Twitter right now. But they used to actually, if you were going to share a news story, would say, hey, do you want to read that first? If you hadn't clicked on it to go look at it. And so there are ways in which you can slow down about these sorts of things. Let me answer one of the questions that people invariably ask when we're doing this, and that is, are there meaningful individual differences? Who's most likely to adopt and spread disinformation and false information? At this point, the data show that people who are older, people who are more conservative, and more religious are more likely to spread disinformation campaigns. There are some people who argue that this might have something to do with maybe cognitive declines or thinking styles. I'm personally of the view that this has to do with who's targeted by disinformation campaigns. That most disinformation campaigns is currently targeted more at conservative voters, currently targeted more at older voters and more religious voters. And that I think all of us are susceptible to these things. And it's just a question of whether or not you're the target at this moment when we're looking at these sorts of things. So from my perspective, it's too soon to accept that there are individual differences, but you should be aware that I'm looking at a room of people who are probably targets, not just for disinformation, but for fraud campaigns. And all of us are in that group when we're looking at this. So from my perspective, we have a perfect storm of disinformation. False information gets repeated constantly. It's oftentimes from the places you're viewing it is consistent with your worldview. It comes from sources that you trust. It's part of how you identify as being part of that group. And that false information gets repeated. Did I already say that? It's easier to process. True information is actually complex usually. When I talk about science, it's actually complex. But the false stuff, it's simple. It's easy to understand and pick up on. It's really easy to share it with your friends and family. So if you encounter it once, you're going to encounter it multiple times. We're typically not engaged in critical thinking. We're typically more engaged in heuristic processing, just accepting information. The information is oftentimes not just related to our group, but to our personal identity about how we think about ourselves. And it's almost never corrected. And if it is corrected, you don't usually see it, the correction. So it's really not the easiest thing to find it. And did I already say this? It's repeated. That false information, if you've seen it once, you've seen it 100 times when we're looking at this sort of stuff. And so there's a real problem here. So how do we solve it? Well, there are two sorts of approaches we can take. One is to focus on the individual, what you as individuals can do, and whether or not critical thinking skills will save you. And I'm just going to be straight up with you. There are things you can do, but critical thinking is not going to save you or save our society, actually, and I worry about that. So we should also talk about the media context as well, the information environment we're swimming in. What can we do to reform the news? What can we do to reform social media? Well, let's start with individual focus, critical thinking. Again, critical thinking can make things worse because you can follow along a path and feel and get deeper into a subject and feel like you're being critical about things, but you're just getting deeper and deeper into the disinformation. And so what real critical thinking involves is stepping outside of that, is doing lateral searches, is looking at other sites and getting different information when we're looking at this, checking the facts on this, checking your sources, and being careful about this, and making the assumption when you're looking at this that there are bad faith actors. Not everybody is telling you the truth when you look at this. I really like the SIFT method, which comes from Mike Caulfield and some of his colleagues. Mike's been down at the University of Washington associated with the Center for an Informed Public. And it's an acronym where the S stands for slow down or stop. Don't just automatically adopt the information. You just slow down and double-check things. And double-checking things means investigating the sources and the claim and stepping outside of the information that you started with. And the F here stands for finding trusted sources, reliable information. Even if you don't necessarily always trust them, but at least get it from different places to double-check things. And when you can, trace that information back to the original to see where it comes from when you're looking at these sorts of things. I always add one more when I talk about this in terms of being a good critical thinker, and that is the more you want something to be true, the more you should check it. Because the things you want to be true are the things that already fit with your worldview, and those are the ones that you're most likely to adopt if they're false. And so you should double-check the things you would love to be true. You can also, even if the platforms don't help you on this, you can change your own sharing rules. You can slow down, not automatically share political information. Don't just engage in heuristic, I like this, and I'm going to share it. You can emphasize accuracy goals when you do this. The platforms can obviously help you, make extra steps before you share information, provide immediate fact-checking when possible, and actually make it hard to share false information, to take it off the platforms. They're not doing that, but they could do more of that. And I want to talk about whether or not when you encounter false information, you should try to correct that person. I actually go through a couple of things in my own head when I'm looking at this, when I encounter somebody spreading false information. The first one is, how important is it? Does it really matter? If it doesn't matter, I'm going to let it go usually. But the other thing I think about is, who's my target? Who am I talking to? Am I just trying to change that person's mind? That's maybe hard. But I'm thinking about who the audience of the conversation is. If it's on social media, I know that other people are going to encounter the information as well, and so it's useful sometimes to provide accurate information in response when I'm looking at this sort of stuff. And so my goal is oftentimes to correct for other people, unless it's my family context, and I'm trying to make sure we're all, tracking good information. How do you go about correcting? First, you should generally be polite. Calling somebody an asshole is really not probably helping the argument that much, although we're all tempted sometimes. Pardon the recording. When you can, give links to the correcting information and stating clearly the problem, the false information, reminding them of the true information, and creating that truth sandwich when you go about doing it. There's also really nice work by one of my former students, Madeline Jalbert, who's also down at the University of Washington, the Center for an Informed Public. And what Maddie has been working on is these things she calls social truth queries, where you don't actually have to correct, but you can just call out the fact that maybe I don't agree with you. Where did you get that information? How reliable is your source? Have you checked this with other things? And just putting out there that there's reasons to be concerned about this, and checking to see if people. This is really good for the audience who sees what you're doing, because it communicates not only there's reason to doubt that information, but it says not everybody agrees with that information. It gets at that false social consensus that we experience sometimes. When we also looking at the individual's focus, I think a lot about saving our family and friend networks. We all know that, we have fewer conversations around some topics, and maybe we don't even talk to some people anymore. I was just visiting his family in the South in June. There were conversations we didn't have. But I stay in touch. And it's important to stay in touch and to try and reconnect. And you need to maintain those supporting relationships, because eventually you may get through. You have to think about this as persistence, as playing the long game here. You can also try and help people change their media or change your own media as well. Switching news sources, some great work showing that switching from Fox to CNN decreased some people's belief in some false information. Some nice work on that. You can add new follows in social media, people who you do trust and who are good people to follow. And you can cut down on the number of repeat spreaders of disinformation. Don't follow those people when we're looking at this. But look, critical thinking is not going to save us. Our own individual work is not going to be enough, because you're flooded by disinformation. I am too. It's often repeated. It's rarely corrected. Social media platforms are making this worse. The news media is making this worse, particularly certain climates of certain sources. Certain trusted sources may not be reliable. And no matter how solid the foundation of your critical thinking, your house is going to be swept away by this flood of disinformation that's out there. To solve the disinformation crisis, it's going to take more than just individual focus. And by the way, here I'm doing my truthiness thing. I'm putting a pretty picture that's not really illustrative of what I'm saying, but it makes it feel better, right? When I'm doing these sorts of things. I can play the game of being convincing when I do this. So let's talk about the context. One of the first and most important things for both social media and news media is de-platform repeat spreaders of disinformation. The widespread of most disinformation, there's a lot of rumors that percolate around, but the widespread of that is usually dependent upon a few individuals, not those individuals without much audience. It takes somebody with audience to get it widespread. Trump was the single person who spread the most COVID misinformation in 2020. The most COVID misinformation was spread by Trump. It's great. The false election information that was spread between November 2020 and January 6th of 2021 there were like 100 accounts that were the biggest spreaders of that false information. And many pieces of vaccine disinformation are spread by the dirty dozen. There's like a dozen people who are really well connected and spread that false information. One of them is RFK Jr. Is one of the big spreaders of vaccine disinformation. If we deplatform these people, it's effective. And I really mean it's effective. The deplatforming and removing Trump and some of the other election deniers really cut down on the amount of false information around the election that was spread after they removed them after the January 6th insurrection. Coup attempt? I don't know. Pick your word when you're looking at that. And so it's important for social media and news media to deplatform. News media's got to quit inviting people back who are known spreaders of false information. Change the algorithms. The algorithms are a bit of a mess, right? The goal is to keep you engaged and to generate income with your eyeballs, and this often leads to you seeing more and more extreme versions of information, which is fine if you're watching music videos on YouTube and they show you other music videos you think you're going to like. That's cool. It's a good way to lose an hour or two. It's fine if you're looking at cat videos because they're going to show you more cute cat videos. It's not fine when you're looking at disinformation. And it feeds on emotion. So keeping you engaged is really dependent upon emotion. Surprisingly, anger really keeps people engaged. And so making people angry is very effective for maintaining engagement. So if you start searching for disinformation or one conspiracy theory, if you go down one rabbit hole of disinformation, you're not just going to get shown that stuff, you're going to get shown other disinformation campaigns. They're going to pop up on your news media as well because many of the super spreaders spread multiple sets of stuff. They go with the election denial, they go with anti-vaccine stuff. And so the platforms need to, for some of the political stuff and science stuff, emphasize accuracy, not just engagement. Doesn't seem like a big ask, but it's apparently a big ask to cut the links to false and harmful information. I'm going to show you an example I did a couple of years ago in 2021 when it was about time to get my COVID vaccination. I did 2 different searches on a computer where I had never searched for COVID vaccine information, so it was a clean computer, right? And I first searched for COVID vaccine. And when I did that, it showed me times when they might be available and locations around Bellingham where they might be available, which was all good information, reliable information. And then I searched for, should I worry about the COVID vaccine, right? And I just clicked on the very top link there, which was a YouTube video, should you worry about COVID vaccine side effects? This actually was a good video. I believe it was from the Gates Foundation and provided accurate information. But I want you to look closely at the sidebar, the next set of things that they suggested to me. Because that sidebar, which I've blown up here, has some good things and some stuff that's just a bunch of false information. And look, there's this nurse who's not going to get the COVID vaccine. I wonder why she's worried about it. So you click on that one. And when you click on that one, the next sidebar is almost entirely false information. This is 2 clicks. And I'm down a rabbit hole of disinformation around the COVID vaccine. Change the algorithms. This is one of the basic rules, is that if you really want to clean up our information environment, you've got to change the environment. So part of that means improving news media as well. I really am concerned with false equivalencies, both sides, the sorts of stuff that news media loves to do. You've got to recognize that there are bad faith actors and bad faith arguments, and you need to quit platforming those things. You need to instead emphasize accuracy. I don't care if they're entertaining. If they lie a lot, you should keep having them back on there. Deplatforming matters for social media. It matters for news media as well. So you've got to deplatform those people. The platforming of climate change denialists is part of the reason why it's taking so long to get anywhere. It's part of the reason why all of you don't think as many people who actually think we should be doing something do think that, right? You have this false belief because of that. So my conclusions. People, when I say people, I mean you, I mean me. We're humans. All of us are susceptible to misinformation and disinformation campaigns. We're frequently exposed to disinformation. Actually, I think we're flooded with it. There's just so much stuff out there, it's making it really hard to think clearly about a lot of issues. Critical thinking helps, but it's really just not enough. It's not going to be enough to save us. We've got to change the information environment as well. Doing this is really important for solving society's problems. We can't come to an agreement about the state of the world. We can't really come to an agreement about how to solve those problems. I also really think it's important for saving families and friend networks as well. That there are members of my family who I really care deeply about, and I would like to be able to talk to them about all sorts of things, not having to restrict the sorts of conversations we have. And I'm going to stop here and take as many questions as I can, and I'm happy to hang around for a while afterwards as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ira. That's just an incredible amount of very useful information. We have just a couple of questions from the committee, and then we're going to go to the audience because I suspect there are many questions to ask. Mentioned illustrations, images, photos. Can you talk a little bit about how to recognize what's false?
Oh, so let's talk about AI-generated images. May as well. There are sort of like basic things that will help right now. you should recognize that the AI-generated images are going to get better. They're already getting better, and so it's going to be harder and harder to recognize them. But here are the things, the quick things you can look at. Look at fingers and count the number of fingers. Check out their teeth. These are really easy things because the AI engines know that there are fingers. It knows that there are arms and there are legs, but it doesn't always get the right numbers. And so the AI images have lots of extra fingers. And if it's a group of people, they'll have legs that aren't actually attached to someone and feet that are backwards. So, those sort of little details help. The level of detail in the background is another pretty good giveaway. When you're looking at these sorts of things. So but you just look at these things quickly, right? Heuristic sort of thing, it looks good. When I was teaching a disinformation seminar, I teach my students my senior level seminar, we talk about disinformation, the psychology of disinformation. And last year, when Trump was first arraigned, I asked them if any of them had seen the pictures of Trump being arrested online. And all of those were AI generated at the time, right? But they were like, yeah, I've seen them. It was great. I was like, those are false. And they're like, shit. Right? And so there are times when, my students, they're good at critical thinking, but we looked at the images. The fingers are wrong. The number of legs are wrong. The detail in the background was wrong. It was all pretty good giveaways when you look at this stuff. So there are those sorts of things, but then you can do an image search with Google to find the source of the image. You can actually take a look at what the content of the image is and do a Google search on the content of the image to see whether or not that's true. And again, the more you want to believe it, the more you should check it. And so, let's see if I can do this. Whoops, wrong way. I'll do that one. Let me go to one of my other favorite ones, the Taylor Swift fraud ones. I use it with my college students. So there's somebody out there peddling a website that you can go to and spend money to get Le Creuset, is that how I say it? Cookware, just like Taylor has. And Taylor Swift actually does use this stuff, so there are pictures of her with it. And somebody used AI to generate a voice of Taylor Swift promoting this. And the Le Creuset was not involved in it. Taylor Swift wasn't involved in it. I believe she's suing those people. I trust Taylor on this stuff. But somebody else had a web link in which is taking people's money, which is pure fraud. Just taking people's money and doing this sort of stuff. And so, when we look at these sorts of things, how do you check? Well, you don't just automatically click and go to the website. You double check about whether or not this is reliable information. And AI is generating all sorts of stuff out there. Is that good?
Yeah, that's great. One more question is about age in terms of at what point can we start educating younger children? I mean, given that you've said that most of us, of the gray-haired crowd, are probably getting the most targets.
I think that this is something we should be starting in primary schools. We start teaching kids to go online to look at sources of information. It's helping them be able to discern what are reliable sources and what are less reliable sources of information. I mean, we already do that in K-12 education, talking about reliable and less reliable information, and helping kids start to do that sort of stuff early on seems crucial to me. Helping them know how to do broader rather than narrow searches seems critical as well. We spend a lot of time working on those sorts of things in college, but I know K-12 educators are doing it as well. It seems to me that, the way that I was taught to use an encyclopedia, and the current generation is taught to use the internet for doing their searches on things. And weirdly, when I was younger and Wikipedia first came out, it was, don't use Wikipedia. It's not, Wikipedia is freaking reliable these days, folks. Immediately it gets updated a lot, and so there's some quick changes that are sometimes problematic, but it's not a bad source for just basic starting of things. But again, breadth should be one of the basic things that we teach kids, is not just getting stuck in one website, but looking broader.
Thank you. So do we have some questions? We'll start at the back of the room this time.
And I'm going to hold the mic because we find that if you like this, wave the mic around, it works. So I'm going to hold it in your face. Go for it.
Well, thank you, first of all, for that amazing presentation. My question is, it seemed to me you made a statement that us gray-haired folks and more religious folks are more susceptible to misinformation. Did I hear you say that?
No, not quite that. Let me be really, really careful about what I'm saying when I say that. That we find that older people, more conservative people, more religious people are more likely to have adopted and spread false information. That doesn't mean they're necessarily more susceptible. That's one possible interpretation, is that they're more susceptible. I'm more of the view that they're more frequently the targets of disinformation. And because they're more frequently targeted, they're more exposed to it, they're more repeatedly exposed to it, and the information they encounter is very rarely corrected. And so this puts me at greater. I'm in that gray hair crowd too. I mean, it's not that gray yet, but I'm in the crowd. So it puts people at greater risk when we look at that. Did that help?
Well, that second part answered my question, because I was wondering what your support was for that statement.
Yeah. Oh no. I mean, I can give you data if you want. There are lots of studies that show this. When we look at these sorts of things, there's also really quite impressive data looking at which political figures are more likely to share links to websites that spread false information. And this one actually has been done in multiple nations, and generally more right-wing people across different nations are more political figures, political politicians are more likely to link to and spread false information. The difference is largest in the United States. So it shows up in other countries, but it's a smaller effect in other countries. But the distinction between Republicans, conservative Republicans, and liberal Democrats in the United States is huge in terms of how frequently they spread disinformation, meaning that the things that they link to, you're looking at a difference between, like 1 or 2% for Democrats and 10 to 20% for Republicans. The stuff that they share and link to is false information. And so if you are following politicians with whom you agree, and you are a conservative, you're more likely to encounter false information than if you're a liberal. It would, the other part of it, there's a sense in which reality at this point has a little bit of a liberal bias. And so the reason why liberals aren't targets is because I'm going to tell you about climate change. Well, it actually is happening. And so I don't have to lie to you about that. If I'm going to deny climate change, then I have to spread disinformation. I'm going to tell you that Joe Biden actually won the 2020 presidential election, that there was no fraud in the election. So I don't have to lie to you to tell you that information. If I'm going to tell you that it was fraud, then I have to lie to you. And so some of this, there are people who think that for a lot of things people are concerned with, reality, is more consistent with where the liberals are. That may not always be the case in the future. And so it's for that reason that I say that it's a question of who's targeted and why. And there are going to be some times when liberals are targeted for various reasons. The Taylor Swift stuff, you're probably not likely to be a victim of this fraud campaign to get your money buying Le Creuset cookware. They're not targeting you with this. They are targeting younger people with this one. But, with other frauds, you might be the target. How's that? Okay.
Amy, do you want to take somebody in the front?
Sure.
Question? They're all back here. Okay.
The backbenchers.
Wait, Jane, we have a question here.
Okay. So, what's your definition of gaslighting?
The standard definition of gaslighting, it's a type of disinformation campaign when we're looking at it, right? That I'm trying to get you to the things that you see that you know to be true. I'm trying to convince you that those things are not true. The typical approach, it's a metaphor that comes from a movie, right? But the typical approach has to do with abuse victims and isolating women. So, the original stuff comes from that background, trying to get you to accept that this is actually the way the world is, the way that I'm treating you. This is good. And, it's used now in a political domain as well, so that it's trying to convince you, no, that thing you saw is actually not what you saw. This is what you saw. In some respects, it's a framing sometimes, right, where I'm giving you a different way to interpret the things that we already saw. I don't typically use the term gaslighting because I think I respect where it originally came from, and I don't want to drag it into this domain. But that's me. That's my approach. Yeah.
Oh, wait, is it working? All right. I think deplatforming is a fairly contentious conversation, and I'm curious if you think there is a threshold between deplatforming and censorship.
come prepared for this question. I want to have a little note on free speech. All right. And this is the thing you need to know. When we talk about revising algorithms and deplatforming, these sorts of things, and dropping, the algorithms are already currently choosing things. It is not an open platform where everything gets shown. I think maybe Blue Sky works that way, but it's like the only one I know that sort of everything gets shown from everybody you follow. It doesn't have much of an algorithm. And so it's based on what you saw most recently. The media already is choosing which people to put on. And so they're choosing who they're platforming. That's already not a free speech environment. None of the social media platforms, none of the news media platforms are free speech environments in that way because they're already making selections. And so all I'm saying is put accuracy as part of your goal when you're making your selections, when you're doing these sorts of stuff. But the other part of it, and I want to make a note about tolerance here. This is called the paradox. This is a lovely little thing called the paradox of intolerance, or paradox of tolerance from Karl Popper, one of the great philosophers, philosopher of science, basic philosopher in general. And he knows that, if you tolerate intolerance, eventually intolerance takes control and pushes out all the tolerant people. And so oddly enough, you have to not tolerate intolerance. You have to not tolerate racism. And you need to deplatform people who are promoting those sorts of things. You need to not give them a place to make those sorts of things. It's the Nazi bar metaphor. Is once you let a Nazi into your bar and then a second Nazi comes in, before too long you have a Nazi bar. And it becomes uncomfortable for other people to be there. So that and honestly, the free speech stuff, the platforms are private companies for the most part. They're not the government censoring things. Our First Amendment stuff has to do with the government censoring things. They get to choose who they associate with. If they want to dump me off, good for them. They can choose to do that, and they already do that for various reasons. And most of them already have algorithms about what they show you, which is I want them to emphasize accuracy just a little bit when they're doing these sorts of things. So look, I'm a college professor. I'm a free speech advocate. I believe in the importance of actually communicating a variety of ideas, of having meaningful discourse, of having disagreements sometimes. But it doesn't mean that we should re-platform and constantly platform false information. That's where I draw a line sometimes. And I'm not going to be very tolerant of intolerance, ever. Yeah, it's a good, obviously I'm ready for that question. It comes up. My students ask it too. It's a good question.
You've asked us to look for reliable sources to verify what we're reading. When you're looking, what are your reliable sources?
Multiple sources. I should say when we're doing these sorts of stuff, I look at multiple sources. And so the sources, if I'm looking at news stuff, I read the New York Times and the Washington Post every day. But even they don't get things right. And so every news media also has a bias in which stories they think are worth telling you. And so some of the people I follow on social media are people who come from different perspectives, different political perspectives, because they link to other things that I might not come across otherwise. And again, if I see something that I'm not sure about, I Google search it. And I go through a few different websites before I'm very confident in it. And there's this really nice thing on Google search anymore that for most websites, when it shows a link to the website, it'll have 3 dots on the upper right-hand side. And if you click on those 3 dots, it'll give you information about that website, which is kind of cool to be able to show that. I should have had that available for you here today as well. But there are a lot of things that we could do. But I think that, again, breadth is your friend here. New York Times, Washington Post are fine. They have their own versions of stories that they tell, and it's nice to get other versions. I can't convince myself to go to Fox News. So there are my limits as well. But that's because they repetitively platform spreaders of disinformation. So I'm not going to support them.
We have a question in the back.
So you talked about the older generation information, and then you also talked about conversations that you choose not to have, and then you talked about the paradox of tolerance, and there seems to be a link between all of those, because if I have those conversations all the time, I'm forced to, and if this group of people have siblings and family members who are more likely targeted, but they're not having conversations with them, how are those people going to be less susceptible to disinformation?
That's a great question. When I say that, there are conversations I choose not to have, right? It means at particular times I'm going to choose not to have them. Have I had multiple conversations with my family member who didn't get vaccinated? Yeah. We've talked about it multiple times. And part of the difficulty there is that, it's like I'm one voice, and I know that she's being exposed to a lot of other stuff much more frequently. And false information. And so, intermittent conversations are hard to have an effect there. But do I still love and care about that person? Yes. Would I prefer that they get the COVID vaccine? I haven't checked with them in the last, 6 months. I'm going to see them in a couple months. I hope they do, and I'll keep trying. And so I haven't completely given up. But there are times, though, and I'm sure you feel this way as well, there are times when you're tired of it. There are times when I really don't need to talk about trans people at this moment. I'm supportive, I'm fine, and I don't need to listen to you be intolerant. And so I may choose not to have that conversation, right? I may choose to not talk about Donald Trump. It's kind of hard to avoid. But I may choose to not have that conversation, and choose when and how I do it. Yeah, I don't have a great answer for you, right? I think this is part of why I think it's so hard, is that we talk about this as one of the sort of the classic errors in psychology, is that when we look at a person's behavior, we tend to focus on them as an individual and why are they that way, and we rarely think about the environmental context they're operating in. And that's driving the law, what's going on. And so with the disinformation stuff, it feels to me that we're making this constant fallacy, where what we see is that it's a problem of that person. I'm sorry, I'm pointing at you. Jim, he's your leader, and here I am pointing at him. That we think that it's a problem with that person, and I need to talk to them and convince them. And really, there's only a limited amount that I can do, a limited amount that he can do when this overall context that they're living in that's where the real problem is. And that's that information environment that we're all swimming in, that we're all exposed to, that makes it so difficult. And so, I'm really appreciative of the difficulties here, but I also think that you don't have to bear the full burden. Some of this is, we all do our part, we do what we can, but no one of us is going to save things. It really isn't. All of us have to work at this sort of stuff, and we have to reform the information environment out there if we really want to see changes happening. And you should do your lifts when you can, right? You should help when you can. I'm always happy to go do these sorts of talks places because I care deeply about things. I write about this stuff because I care deeply about these sorts of things. I teach about this stuff because I care deeply. I have conversations with friends and families, even when they're not always the most comfortable, because I care deeply about them as well. But your question for me is like the critical question. It's like, how do I do this? And it's like, yes, and how do we as a society do better in terms of the information environment out there?
So one of the things I've noticed over the last couple of years is how much, quote, trusted news sources that I watch and listen to, unquote, give attention to Donald Trump and showing his rallies, and they don't correct any of the lies or the misinformation. So is that a form of disinformation that's being put out? Because it seems, I don't know if it's for entertainment value or what, but they keep showing these things and giving him so much airtime with no commentary on the validity of what he's saying. So would you speak to that?
So I think the way that we want to approach this, about the issues here about the news media and what they choose to focus on is the problem of false equivalencies, the problem of false balance, of trying to treat everything as both sides, of presenting two sides. And the fact of the matter is, when we're talking about a lot of things, it's like the weather. Is it raining or not? I don't know. Look out the window. Is it raining right now? It's that sort of thing, right? And it either is raining or it's not raining. There either is climate change or there's not climate change. There was enough fraud in the 2020 election to overturn it, or there wasn't. There's not a both sides here. There's actually a truth For a lot of things in the world, there's a ground truth. There is actually a true position, a true state of the world. There are some things where there's less truth, right? Where it's harder to know, or where opinions matter. It's like, do you like my shirt? It's a great shirt. You don't like my shirt? You're wrong, right? I mean, we don't say wrong about that, right? And so it's a really tricky thing, it feels to me, for news media in terms of presenting information, of trying to know when they need to be really clear about what the truth of a situation is, and when there is a place where we need to present multiple positions and multiple views on things. I mean, and the example I gave about, is it possible that Joe Biden has Parkinson's? Again, the answer is no. Okay, that's false information. He does not. The doctor was visiting the White House for a variety of other reasons that had nothing to do with Joe Biden. Never saw Joe Biden when he was there. Okay, but the New York Times is where I encountered that, right? Because they had picked it up from some blogger, and so they shared, hey, he's getting old. He's slowing down. This guy has been going to the White House, and they never said he has Parkinson's. They just sort of put the implication out there. And so, when you look at this sort of stuff, it's like even things I consider generally their news is reliable. I don't agree with all the editorials. I'm not going to agree with all the editorials anywhere. Who am I kidding? So, again, I actually went and looked at that at other places. And when I encountered that, I was like, okay, is this any chance of this being true? And I went and looked at several other sources, and there were other people noting that, no, this guy was at the White House for these reasons. And it's pretty clear that Biden doesn't have Parkinson's. But nonetheless, there was a couple of days there where the New York Times was pushing that story and they didn't actually say he had Parkinson's, but they left you with that implication, right? And so so even the people we consider reliable get things wrong. I get things wrong, right? I mean, I'm pretty careful with the stuff I present when I do this sort of stuff, and in class, I sometimes get things wrong, and I make mistakes. Last I checked, I was still human, and so we do our best on these things.
We have time for one more question, I think.
Google is doing research on pre-bunking and has run several campaigns overseas. They can't do them here in the U.S. What do you think about that?
So, I mean, I've read some of the research on pre-bunking, right? And there's an online.
Can you explain
pre-bunking
what it is?
It's a bit like a truth sandwich, but it's like warning you ahead of time about how to look for false information, and certain tools for looking for false information. So kind of like what I gave you with AI, about what to look for AI photos. But looking for news information. What sorts of things do news stories have that would be indicative of probably presenting false information? And there's some nice stuff by Sander Van Linden and other people who have looked at pre-bunking as a tool. And they have actually an online game that you can play to get better at these sorts of skills. There's other data that shows that the pre-bunking stuff makes people not just doubt the false information, but doubt the true information as well. So that what it does is just decreases your trust in everything. And I have concerns with it. A good friend of mine over at the University of Victoria did a follow-up study where they looked at both true and false information with these pre-bunking tools, and people just doubt everything. So that I'm glad Google is trying, but I would rather Google be more thoughtful about what links they present, and whether or not they link to stuff that's knowingly false when they present things. So there are better tools in Google's tool belt to solve these problems than pre-bunking. Yeah. Do you work for Google? Did I just attack Google? If you did, I was kind of hopeful. Like if you work for Google, I was like, here's why there's a problem. That would make me feel better.
Well, thank you very much, Ira, and thank you everyone for coming. It's just been a great program. It will be the recording will be on the Bellingham City Club website in a few weeks, I think. I'm not sure the exact timing, but look for that. Go through these again. Thank you so much.